Hello, and welcome to this seminar looking at how mind training can increase efficacy for the lawyering community. I'm Louise Chester, the founder of Mindfulness at Work. We're the leading corporate advisor for mindfulness training, working with over 200 organizations in the UK alone, which also includes over 25 law firms and in-house lawyering teams. And we're the UK partner for Potential Project, the world's leading organization for research and gold standard training to optimize the mind and enhance both individual and organizational performance. So Thomson Reuters approached me some months ago to ask if I would share our experience on mindfulness for lawyers. And my first step, as always, is to turn to the experts in our global team. And in this case, it was Jens Näsström, who truly is a global expert in this field. And I asked him if he would lead a webinar on this subject for us. So a little bit of background on Jens. He's been researching, training and supervising lawyers for over 10 years, and he's taught at the Swedish Bar Association's courses for lawyers, the Swedish Bar exam, and in practically all major law firms in Sweden. He started providing mindfulness training for lawyers back in 2006 and is a true pioneer in the field. And in the last few years, he's increasingly turned his focus to efficacy amongst lawyers, and he's generated compelling evidence that corporate mindfulness is uniquely suited to meet the steep demands that lawyers face in a typical workday. He's also one of the first consultants to be trained in the corporate mindfulness training program developed by Potential Project, and has many thousands of flying hours delivering the program both in the lawyering community and beyond. So Jens is uniquely qualified to talk today on the subject matter of this webinar, and I would now like to thank him and turn the floor over to him. Thank you, Jens. Over to you.
Thank you, Louise, for your kind word. It's a great pleasure to team up with you, of course, given that you're an authority in your own right in this field. And I also like to thank Thomson Reuters for giving me this opportunity to talk about my favorite topics. So just briefly to give an overview of my background, these are some of my publications, and they're all available for free. You can just drop me an email, which I will share with you at the end of the webinar. They're all available for free with the exception of Lawyer as Changemakers, which is published by the American Bar Association. So my basic premise or outlook in this work is that there is a gap between the map and the terrain, which is to say there is a gap between how lawyers think they work and how they actually work. And in the coming hour, I will explain why I'm convinced that this misperception of the lawyer profession is a huge source of not only ineffectiveness, but also of frustration and suffering in the legal industry. So this is something that impacts not only the lawyers themselves, but also their clients and law firms and in-house departments. So what is this misperception? Well, at the heart of what a lawyer does lies, of course, his or her legal expertise. And legal expertise is by nature an intellectual, almost scholastic exercise. And from this, it follows that factors associated with the intellectual and scholastically should accurately predict efficacy and success of lawyers. Thus, for instance, when law firms look for the most promising lawyers, they rely heavily upon grade point average, law school pedigree, class rank, IQ, and a law school aptitude test. And so this image of the nature of lawyers' work is strongly entrenched not only in law firms, but also in law schools, and not at least lawyers themselves. The problem is that research consistently show that none of these factors predict efficacy very well. Some of them even have a negative correlation. So, for instance, students with top grades tend to be introverts, which means that they're less apt at networking, marketing, building relationships with clients. So, how do we know this? Well, there is a budding research field on efficacy factors among lawyers, and to date we have about 30 or so studies conducted either by asking lawyers, asking the clients, or asking the law firms. But regardless of who you ask, these studies consistently agree that soft skills is a stronger predictor of efficacy among lawyers than legal skills. So how is efficacy measured? It can be done in various ways, such as asking lawyers to rate each other and themselves, or by asking lawyers to point who they consider to be the best in the field, so-called super lawyers. But again, regardless of how this is defined or measured, the outcome and conclusion of the research is the same. And in this field of lawyer psychology, Susan Dykoff is the great pioneer and authority, and her milestone, Lawyer Know Thyself, summarizes some 40 years of research on lawyers, and this is her conclusion based on an in-depth review of that research. Studies show that top-performing lawyers outstrip other lawyers in competencies such as stress management, independence, self-knowledge, general mood, problem-solving, and interpersonal competencies. So we can see that the current understanding of lawyer efficacy is essentially flawed, and that efficacy is dependent on so much more rather than just having an excellent legal mind. So now let's explore what it means by soft skills and also the implications of looking at lawyering in this new light. And as I just mentioned, we can now count some 30 or so studies on lawyer efficacy, but there is one particular study that towers them all, which is the 2008 Schultz and Sedig study. In this one, they had about 7,000 participants, of which 2,000 were lawyers. They had thousands of questions that were divided into over 30 different surveys. You get the idea. It's a massive, very well designed, very well executed study. So after spending years literally collecting and analyzing data, Sedig and Schultz concluded that efficacy in lawyers can reliably be predicted by 26 factors, and these can be grouped into 8 categories. And these are the 8 categories you see on this particular slide. And so because of time limitation, we'll just today stick to the 8 categories. As you can see, only 2 of these can be placed within the realm of the intellectual capacity and legal expertise in the strict sense of the word. The rest of them are essentially legal skills. So this is the proportion that we end up with 1/4 of legal and cognitive skills being the predictive factor. This doesn't mean, of course, that it's not important to be highly intelligent or legal. I think here it's important to remember that practically all decent lawyers are very intelligent and also very proficient in their legal skills. So they're pretty close as a cluster, while you have a much greater variation among lawyers when it comes to the soft skills. But what happens if we take stock of the curriculum of law schools and compare them to the 26 skills identified by Schultz and Sedig? Interestingly enough, we see an almost exact reversal in proportions. That is, about 3/4 of the efficacy factors are rarely or never taught in law schools. And these 3/4 are, of course, soft skills. This is the main reason for the peak in stress that we see in newly graduated lawyers. They are entering a working situation for which they're not fully trained, leaving them to struggle the first couple of years in their career, learning these additional skills ad hoc. And I'm sure many of you remember being a bit overwhelmed in that primary period of your career as lawyer and not feeling fully prepared for what you were asked to do or expected. So we can now see that referring to a lawyer as a legal expert is a bit narrow, and he or she is perhaps more of a legal consultant, advisor, but also knowledge worker. And a knowledge worker, as opposed to a body worker, uses his or her mind to produce value. And from this, it follows that the state of your mind is decisive for the quality and the quantity of your work. If you're out of balance, such as being tired, angry, or stressed, it will be directly reflected on the output of your work. And this is, of course, in stark contrast to if you're working by a machine in a factory, in which your state of mind is much less critical. And here I'd just like to add also that I personally don't really like the term soft skills. It has not only the wrong connotation, I mean, what kind of lawyer wants to be soft, but it's also not a very good description. So I much prefer the term facilitation skill, because these are the skills that facilitate the legal expertise. And so this is just sort of a background, and I'd now like to approach lawyering from a related but somewhat different perspective, which is mindfulness. We just concluded that lawyering is knowledge work par excellence, and that mind is primary for this line of work. And this is really where mindfulness comes into play. So let's take a bird's eye perspective on mindfulness within the corporate world. So these are just a selection of the companies that are working together with potential projects. And why are they using mindfulness? Well, clearly these are no charities, and the reason therefore is clearly because it works and it generates bottom line results that are relevant. Now, mindfulness is a secular, scientifically validated branch of an old tradition of mind training with Asian roots, but I'm personally absolutely convinced that it has a particular relevance for our times. And by our times, I mean the last decade or so. Because we're now living in what is sometimes called the paid reality. And this reality is, which we frequently feel pressured, always on, information overloaded. Just think about that inbox. And all these inputs are primarily coming through various screens. And I think the big shift here came when the iPhone came about 2007 or so. So last year I took about 4,000 surveys, half of which were filled out by lawyers before the iPhone came out, and the rest of the surveys were distributed last year. So I had 2,000 lawyers in 2005, and then I had about another 2,000 last year filling out work psychological surveys. And here we could definitely see a statistically significant increase in sleeping problems, emotional distress, lack of boundaries between work and leisure life. So just a general increase of pressure among lawyers, which I think many of you will also readily recognize. Now, what happens to the brain when it is consistently exposed to being pressured, always on, and information overloaded? Well, we tend to develop a mental fatigue, which means that we tend to get drawn to distractions. So our capacity for paying attention gets eroded. In fact, we are increasingly developing something called attention deficit trait, which is a psychological disposition characterized by severely weakened ability to truly pay attention. So let's just stop here for a brief moment and let me ask you, in percentage, how much of the time do you think you are mentally fully present and aware in the activity at hand? So any given situation, you're doing something. How much of the time in percentage do you think you are mentally present? And you can just add that into the chat box and we'll see what kind of numbers come out there. And while we wait for the number, I may add that when you ask people to estimate, they typically underestimate because people that haven't really trained their attention, they tend to overrate their ability to pay attention. So when they conducted a major study in California with some 5,000 people, they came up with this number, 47%, or about half of the time. And so some of you are very close here. We're seeing 50, 60, 70%. Of course, it differs from day to day and from what time of the day and so on. But it seems like many of you are fairly close to this. For knowledge workers, this is decisive because all our results come from executing the right executing the right actions based on making the right choices, which directly stems from us paying attention to the right things at work. So we all know the feeling of, at the end of a long, hard day's work, recognizing that we still have not gotten to that really important but sour project. So it's, of course, very important to not only get a lot of things done, but getting the right things done. And this is, of course, very critical when you have the time to do all the things that would be nice to do, but you strictly have to prioritize the must-to-dos. But there are many other facets beyond just being productive and effective, dependent on whether we are focused or not. And from this list, we can readily see that there are no boundaries between feeling well and doing well, between getting work done and feeling good. These two are really intrinsically linked if you're serious about sustainable, long-term effectiveness. So modern brain scanning technology has taught us that brains, even in adults, change in accordance with our thoughts, our speech, behavior, and environment. So if you pick up a violin as an adult and start practicing regularly, the part of the brain that coordinates the fingers in your left hand will grow physically more tense, creating a richer network, and will also use more energy in terms of oxygen and glucose. This raises an interesting question. Is it possible to train our capacity attention, which is the very foundation for just about everything lawyers do? Listening, reading, writing, reflecting, negotiating. These are all activities that are wholly dependent on your attention span. And yes, research conclusively show that with training, you can increase your attention span and counteract the eroding effects of paid reality, which is shaping our brains in the negative direction. Thus, mindfulness is the practice of managing your attention. It has two aspects, one inner, by which we practice the attentional muscle, and then one external, in which we learn and apply strategies that support mindfulness. And in corporate mindfulness, we include both of these aspects. We train mindfulness daily, but we also learn to turn off notifications in Outlook so that we don't get distracted by incoming emails when we're writing a contract. How much, then, training does it take to get noticeable effects? Interestingly enough, the muscles of the brain are most effectively trained in a fashion very similar to those of the body. So if you want to build your biceps, for instance, you don't have to train all day long. You just have to push yourself a little by lifting a weight close to your limit for a few minutes on a regular basis. And similarly, research showed that you only have to train mindfulness for 10 minutes a day for a few weeks to get noticeable effects. And perhaps this is a good point for us to just very briefly get a sense, a taste of what this training entails. So I'll guide you through a very, very brief practice. And don't worry, if you're sitting in an open office landscape, you can do it with open eyes and you won't look weird or anything like that. So here in this particular program, all you have to remember is ABCD. That really covers all the basic instructions here. So let's take just 2 or 3 minutes and try out this practice. And we're starting with the anatomy. You want to have a alert yet relaxed body posture. So you straighten your back, make sure your feet are resting squarely on the floor, or hands on your knees or in your lap. And if it's appropriate or if you're comfortable with it, you can close your eyes. If not, just place a soft gaze in a 45-degree angle in front of you. And then you shift your attention to the breath. So you gently place your attention on the sensations of the breath. This is not a conceptual thinking exercise. You should experience the sensations of the breath going in through the nostrils, down to the belly, turning and going out again. So just let your breath come naturally, following the belly, rising and sinking with each breath. And you emphasize focusing on the breath as you breathe in, relaxing, letting go on the out breath. Letting go of all thoughts, all impulses to do things and work. And whenever you find yourself being distracted, you just release the distraction and return to the breath. And then you can release the practice and come back to the room and this presentation. So by doing this in a consistent, focused manner for 10 minutes a day, I practically guarantee you're getting results. It's just like training your biceps. If you do the practice, you will get results. There is a variation from individual to individual exactly what type of results you're getting, but very common ones are reduced stress, improved sleep, and increased efficacy. So let's step back for a bit and review what we covered so far. Soft skills, or facilitation skills, as I prefer to call them, are critical for the performance and well-being of lawyers. And mindfulness is a very important training approach to work for knowledge workers in a paid reality. And corporate mindfulness is nothing else than a protocol that integrates soft skills with attention training. While this is an intriguing working hypothesis, we should, of course, not accept it at face value. So let's look at cutting-edge research that puts this hypothesis to the test. And let's start by reviewing the correlation between lawyers' capacity for attention and their efficacy. This data comes from a major survey I conducted last year in collaboration with the Swedish Bar Association, and you see there are about 1,800 lawyers that participated. You see the full list of factors that were covered in the survey and which were correlated with self-rated efficacy. So we don't really have time here to delve into the finer methodological points. So sufficient to say I used a widely used, repeatedly validated scale that reliably measures efficacy. As you can see, the two strongest predictors of efficacy was capacity for attention, or simply mindfulness, and leadership. These two were almost identical in strength and outperformed the other factors by a metaphorical mile. Please note that these lawyers had not trained mindfulness, and what we see here is the natural baseline, the natural capacity for paying attention. Even so, attention is powerful enough to end up at the top of this list. Let's look at another group of lawyers. Here we see a mix of UK and Australian lawyers that were enrolled in a corporate-based mindfulness training program, but this measurement was done before the program and again represents their natural baseline data. The only statistically reliable predictor of efficacy among these factors was again mindfulness. So from this we may conclude that there is solid support for the correlation between attention and effectiveness among lawyers. Now, let's ask if corporate mindfulness training actually enhances the capacity for attention. For this, we're relying upon one of the most widely used scales to measure attention and awareness, which is simply called the Mindfulness Attention Awareness Scale. These first three numbers are taken from research done at academic institutions, such as the University of Stockholm. And we see here a range from 8 to 20%, and having looked at dozens and dozens of measurements of corporate mindfulness training, I would say these numbers are fairly typical. So this is very well validated again in many studies that by doing this training, you are increasing your attention span. So now we're in a position to add the last empirical piece to get the full picture. So to summarize the evidence so far, attention is important. Attention can be enhanced by mindfulness training. Soft skills are also critical and can also be trained. Corporate mindfulness incorporates the two into a training protocol. If all these links connect, then we should see an interesting set of positive outcomes if you train lawyers in corporate mindfulness. Here we have the outcome of some 17 UK lawyers, and you see an increase of attention by almost 11%, effectiveness likewise, a reduction of multitasking, which is, of course, directly detrimental for effectiveness, increase in work-life balance by some 6%, emotional exhaustion is reduced by more than 14%, and emotional exhaustion could also be termed emotional stress, and is the core component of burnout. So here we see a powerful antidote for burnout. Interestingly, we see an increase in preference for teamwork as well. This data is fully aligned with research in general on the outcomes of corporate mindfulness among knowledge workers. And as a researcher, I see them all the time, and in potential projects, we see them all the time as well. And here I have to emphasize that we're talking about a workplace adapted form of mindfulness, corporate mindfulness. Generic mindfulness training can be great, but it typically fails, and sometimes miserably so, in the workplace. So I think that's an important point to make as well. Here is an overview of outcomes that are correlated with mindfulness in organizational settings. It may seem strange that you can achieve this just by focusing on the breath, but here we have to remember that one of the strongest and most well-established outcomes of mindfulness training is a substantial reduction in stress. And many of these outcomes have a strong correlation with level of stress. And here we see a list of outcomes for the individual that is at least as interesting. And this again underlines the point that there is no tension, no conflict of interest between performing well and a real sense of well-being among knowledge workers. Now I'd like to spend a few minutes just clarifying the ingredients in a corporate mindfulness training program and the format in which it is delivered. Then we'll round off by introducing a few simple but powerful actions that you can apply tomorrow for a greater workday. At the heart of the program lies mindfulness practice itself. And this is the same brief practice that we tried out earlier in this session. For almost 5 years, this was what I was introducing to lawyers in my own workshops. But I never could figure out what the next step would be to develop mindfulness in the workplace until I came across Potential Project's brilliant integration with soft skills. So when I stumbled upon the idea of corporate mindfulness, of putting together more traditional time and stress management, techniques with mindfulness, then I started reviewing the various programs on the market. And I came to the conclusion that Potential Project program is indeed the gold standard. And to this day, it's the only material I use for lawyers that I have not developed myself. And I'm not really the only one. A previous head of learning at Herbert Smith Freehills is now a full-time partner at Potential Project in Australia. But let's get back to the program components. So the core mindfulness practice is done together with your colleagues in a group setting for 10 minutes every day. Then every week throughout the program, you get together with a mindfulness trainer for an hour or an hour and a half. And you get introduced to various work themes, such as mindful email, mindful meetings, and so on. So these are just applications of mindfulness or mindful approaching various working situations. We fortify that with mental strategies that are cognitive approaches for addressing and dealing with various challenging situations that you may face at work and also at home. Let's take the list of soft skill categories identified by Schultz and Sedig and juxtapose that with a corporate-based mindfulness training program. So here you see a short program, a 5-week program. You get together once a week for an hour and a half. And the first session, you will go through an introduction, and you'll also talk about mental effectiveness and get a general sense of the program. And then you have various work themes that you go through every week, every session, and mental strategies. And so if we're trying to map it out, you see, for instance, if you look at session 2, which covers the work themes, mindful breaks and emails, and the mental strategy of patience. This content can clearly be correlated with planning and organizing your work because those modules include tips on how to organize and schedule your workday, in addition to the soft skill categories, communication and working with others. And then you also have the last 2, which can be associated with conflict resolution and character. So through the mental strategy of patience, you build your character, and you're also better able to manage conflict and working with others. So this is just one very interesting way to see how they're mapping and how they're complementing each other. And unfortunately, I very rarely see these kind of training programs in law firms. So a lot of lawyers typically are left to fend for themselves to learn these skills. So now I'd like to share some simple applications, some golden nuggets from the corporate mindfulness training program that will also give you a more concrete sense of just how mindfulness and soft skills come together in this program. So, number 1 tip for tomorrow is not to have your smartphone in the bedroom. So tonight, place it in the next room, or even better, replace it with an old-fashioned alarm clock. Because if you start the morning by checking Facebook, news, and eventually work-related email, you will spike your levels of stress hormone, sap your ability to focus, and generally be more absent-minded from your partner and your family. So the instruction here is to enjoy your first hour without the smartphone or iPad or whatever you're having. Pay attention to how you're feeling, how you're doing, and to those near and dear you. Some time ago, I met with a partner who had gone through this program, and I asked him, okay, so what was the number 1 takeaway for you? And he said, well, there was really one thing that made a huge difference for me. And that was to stop checking work-related email by 9 o'clock in the evening and to just generally avoid screens until I came throughout my door in the morning. That saved me 3 hours of stress every day. And he was utterly convinced that would have saved his life because he had problems, a history of heart attacks, for instance. So just really small, simple things like that can make a huge difference for people. Next step is to download the app and listen to the guided practice if you're commuting by public transportation. It might be less suitable if you're driving a car. But if you're commuting by public transportation, this guided practice takes 10 minutes and will help you arrive at the office more calm and collected rather than if you would have just, scattered-minded scrolling through the internet for 45 minutes on the trolley. And so you may do this for 10 minutes, and if you feel very compelled to review your inbox, you could do that, but make sure you don't really get stuck there. But for some of you, that's an important part of planning your day, to just make sure that there are no burning issues in the inbox. That being said, once you arrive at the office, it's time for the third step. So most of us, when we arrive, we really have a strong drive or impulse to get going right away, because we have so much we want to achieve, so much to do. But rather than to follow that impulse, sit down and quietly and calmly take stock of your day. Plan carefully, prioritize, predict challenging work and situations, and take measures to meet them well prepared. And again, if you have to check your inbox, just do it briefly. Don't get stuck trying to catch up, because once you get out of there, your attention span will have gotten sapped seriously. So I think this is really important, because it's early in the day that you have the greatest capacity for paying attention. So that is really the time of the day when you have the greatest capacity for doing deep, substantial work, working on documents and so on. Next, make sure you kill all notifications to make sure you can work uninterruptedly. So these were 4 simple steps, and if you try them out tomorrow, you might find yourself by the evening not having been able to really consistently apply them throughout the day. And if that is the case, then it is probably because you faltered in your attention. So that is how we use attention to drive our changes in our behaviors and to implement the tips and the tricks. So this is very much like changing a diet or starting to train. You know what you need to do, but the question is, how do you create those behavioral and thought changes? And that's where the attention training comes into play. Last minute, I also decided to add actually a 5th tip here, which is a major problem for some of you, but I'd like to challenge you to try it out. So to avoid email addiction, the instruction is to take stock of how often you have to check your email to stay on top. And so as a lawyer, you may have to do that fairly often. It could be every other hour, or once every hour, or perhaps every 30 minutes if you're in a project that is approaching deadline. It doesn't really matter. The important thing is to check as often as you need, but not more often, not less often. So this definitely goes for office hours, and then you'll have a different range in evenings and weekends. And I see an increasingly huge growing problem here for lawyers when it comes to having vacation and to having uninterrupted vacation. And for some of you, that might be a thing of the past to have it uninterrupted. You may have to check your email every day on your vacation. But if so, you only do it once, and you not do it again and again and again. And that, again, takes self-discipline and a fair attention span. We also have the app, and we'll make sure that you'll get a link for that. Otherwise, you can just drop me or Louise an email. And we also have 2 excellent books. And the one second ahead describes the corporate mindfulness training in depth, and it's a great companion to the app. The Mind of the Leader isn't out yet, but it will be published by Harvard Business Press in March. It's their first title on mindfulness. And as you might remember, in my research, I identified leadership as a very strong predictor of efficacy among lawyers. And at the same time, we know this is what is often called an area in which lawyers have great potential for development. So it's definitely something to look into. And our current understanding of leadership also encompasses self-leadership. So I think it's a great read for just everyone who is working in legal settings. So this was the bulk of what I wanted to cover today. Louise, do you want to jump in and add something?
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you so much, Jens. I always find it absolutely fascinating and always enjoy hearing you speak. I just wanted to share with you all one last quote, which is from the American lawyer, and I'm just going to read this out to you. Soft skills or facilitation skills matter. Soft skills matter. Clients have so many good law firms to choose among that they don't have to hire jerks anymore. When high performance skill is a given, other factors loom larger. Trust, comfort, dedication, and empathy. These were once dismissed as soft or emotional traits. It turns out they're only soft for hard people. So with that, I wanted just to turn over to questions and again say thank you, Jens, for that great presentation.
Great. So we have some time left for questions and answers, and we also want to make sure that we don't end at a full hour, because some of you are probably having meetings at a full hour, but we do have another 5 or 10 minutes.
So maybe if any of you would like to put some questions into the chat box, that would be great. I've got one here. Jens, more details on the science and the research. Are you able to share? Have you got more information that you can share with everybody?
Absolutely. I have one general review of the research on corporate mindfulness, and then I do have a particular one for lawyers, and I'm very happy to send them out. So you can just drop me an email. You see the email on this slide. And I think in general, questions from participants in this webinar who are located in the UK, I think it might be advantageous for them to contact you, Louise, and I can take any international questions. But I'm very happy to share the research in this presentation, and there's so much more. So it's very fascinating stuff, definitely.
Okay. And let's see here. There's one here. Any advice different from a law student who's always under pressure in terms of, under pressure in terms of education and having to find training schemes? Gosh, that's quite a, so maybe on law students and the pressure that they generally feel in terms of their education. Jens, would you like to take that one?
Oh, absolutely. And essentially it boils down to the same, there will be a similar pressure once you get out of law school. So it's all about buckling down and learning time and stress management right away. And so you will find great tips in the book, 1 Second Ahead. I think it is very well spent time building a practice of mindfulness, because mindfulness is not only about paying attention, it's also about regulating thoughts, letting go of anxiety thoughts, and regulating stress, and being able to relax and let go, which is so important, so important. And the earlier you will learn this in this career, the better it is. I think the most heartbreaking thing I ever saw was I had done a full-day presentation on stress management for lawyers, and after the workshop, an older man came up to me and said, thank you so much. Unfortunately, this came too late for me. And it was almost on the verge of crying, and I really don't know what he was referring to, but it was heartbreaking that he had seen something in the presentation that would have made a difference for him if he would have been exposed to that 40 years earlier. So a lot of things that you learn in these programs, you can learn through a regular career, but it will take you 20 or 30 years. So if you're young, make sure you spend about 2, 3, 4, 5% of your study time to learning stress and time management consistently, and just make that part of your regimen or your how you spend your time studying. So
great. Thanks. Yeah, I've got another one here, which is somebody who says that they want to know how to bring this into their organisation. Do we have a roadmap? What are our tips for doing that most successfully? And maybe I might start off with answering that one, which is what we would say is don't try to pitch this yourself internally. Bring someone in. It's very hard to be articulate and convincing yourself. It's better to bring somebody in who can actually, you can take them to your head of L&D or HR or whoever. One of the things that we do suggest is we nearly always start off by doing a sort of introductory workshop up to about an hour or so. Maybe over a partner lunch, or do it for HR and managing partners. And that gives everybody in the room the understanding of, what mindfulness is and isn't, the science behind it. They get to do a practice just as you did, so they see that, you don't have to sit cross-legged and knit your own yogurt. This is training for the mind, and it's very effective. And what is also really important is whoever you get to come in, it's great if they have lawyering experience, if they're a lawyer themselves or they've done a lot of work with law firms, because I think that to make sure that the training is absolutely relevant for the lawyering profession is crucial, and the language that the trainer will use and the way they will design either the workshop or the program will be tailored particularly to that profession, and I think that's absolutely crucial, that it feels really, really relevant. Any other suggestions there, Jens?
I just love all the tips here by doing a step-by-step introduction into the organization, and I fully agree that this is a very demanding audience. Lawyers will pick you apart if you don't know what you're talking about. But they're also very disciplined and they're very alert. So if you make a strong case for something, they are really great at adapting and learning new things. So that's one of the reasons why I love working with lawyers. It's really demanding, but also very, very rewarding. So just thank you. Great outline there for how to approach this.
I think one of the most important things that I've learned is how important it is to absolutely know the science. So all of the whole sort of global team that we've got in the lawyering faculty, they know the science behind everything absolutely, back to front and inside out, because they know that that's going to be important to really state the facts and have them rock solid. So that's something that is particular to this and this profession and professional services and financial services particularly. So it's been interesting over the 8 or 9 years that we've been doing this to note that. And I've got another question here is, how would you suggest that I explain to my manager I'm taking 10 minutes to be mindful? Jens, do you want to take that one?
Well, no one is performing at the top of the cognitive capacity for 8 hours. So I was talking to one partner, and he said, well, if I was my own client, I would only bill for the first 3 hours of the day, which I think was a startling thing to hear him say, because what he was saying is, I'm really at the top for the first 3 hours of the day. The rest of the day, I'm really a bit, mentally tired, and everyone knows this. You can't really have the top performance throughout the day. And sometimes your brain gets tired. You get this kind of mental haze, brain haze or mental fatigue. And to recuperate, to make a consistent, clean break, this is a much more effective break than if you browse around on Facebook or if you chit-chat with your colleagues over a cup of coffee. You are giving the cognitive or the conceptual part of your brain a clean break. It's like restarting the computer. So you are doing a very disciplined, very effective break. And there's much research to show that. If you keep working, or keep doing other conceptual things, you're not going to get that rest and recover effect truly. But I like to refer to that partner who really described how he himself noticed that he wasn't really super effective after 3 hours, which is a shame because if he was taking mindful breaks, he could keep top performing throughout the day. But you got to take those breaks, and you got to be effective.
And those breaks during the day, Jens, don't need to be 10-minute breaks, do they? We teach performance breaks, which are much shorter.
Yes. You do the 10-minute practice to build a capacity, to build a skill. Then throughout the day, as you're noticing that you're getting tired, it can be 30 seconds, it can be 3 minutes. You take them as you need them. And throughout the practice, you get to know yourself. You get to catch yourself being tired, and then you take the breaks. So it's also something that you learn throughout time. But certainly you're not taking 10 minutes all along. No.
So there's another question about, are there specific apps on the phone we can download to do mindfulness while commuting to work? There are plenty of apps. Which one would you recommend? As Jens said earlier, the Potential Project app is free to download, and we would thoroughly recommend that. It's great. Jens, how would you say that would be best for people to access that?
I'm sure we can find a way to share a link. Perhaps Thomson Reuters can send one out to the registered participants. Otherwise, they can drop an email to me. There will be, I think there will be a recording of this that is being shared, and we can put up the link there as well. We will find a way to get that link to you for sure. And there are many great mindfulness apps. The advantage with this one is that it's compatible with the 1 Second Ahead book, and it does have that workplace adaptation, which I think is very important.
Yeah. I've got a question here. There's a question here which I often get asked, and I think that this will be our last question, but and I'm not quite sure how never quite know I'm sure how to answer this, but how do I retrain clients who expect me to drop everything and always prioritize their needs? And I think probably everybody listening to this webinar is nodding and smiling at that. What we often say is, introduce us to them, and we'll train them too. And in fact, we do a lot of training for law firms for their clients, actually, which is quite interesting. But it's a good question. Jens, how would you like to answer that one?
Well, difficult clients is a whole subject unto itself. The key here is that you should not have to retrain them. When you get a new client on board, you introduce them into how you work. And part of that is saying, I will always respond to your emails within 24 hours. If there is a legal need for a quicker response than in 24 hours, you can rely on me following up on that. But for me to be important, I'm not answering emails all day long. I answer them as they need from a legal perspective. I understand that might be frustrating, but so you have to establish how you are working from the perspective of, on the one hand, taking care of the client's interest, on the other hand, to protect the most effective way for you as a lawyer to organize your work. So it's a little bit, you have to raise clients. And then even though you've done that, they are going to come through in different ways. And then you just refer to, as I said, first time we met, I will always get back to you as needed or within 24 hours. And just very respectfully, very consistently, patiently refer to that again and again. But it is important to initially establish that. Otherwise, you have to, as you say, retrain, and it's very hard to retrain clients, as you know. And I say that being very aware of that. Some clients out there are very challenging, and so that's why we have the topic of client psychology. If you're interested in client psychology, send me an email, and I will send you a very nice introduction to that particular topic with some great approaches for managing difficult clients. It's a fascinating topic as well.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Jens. It's been really interesting to hear your research and expertise on this topic. I've learned a lot, even though it's a subject pretty well. Everybody else on the webinar has too. Thank you so much for joining us for this webinar, and please do feel free to drop us an email and thank you as well, because we post some really interesting search articles which I think you will enjoy. So we look forward to reading with many of you over the months ahead, and I just thank you all for your attention over this last hour.
Thank you all. Thank you all.